but then you can't
I like
play.
to do it.
Okay.
I get recognition for helping with play. So that's fine.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Alan.
I got invited to go to Dubai for 2 years.
I'll have it for you by the end of next week.
Oh gosh.
Also,
you can take 2 weeks or whatever.
I saw Ray the other day at a committee on foreign relations. He said Barack's coming back today.
Okay.
No, I want to know.
Hey, how are you? And he wants to has some real interesting information, and she said he might want to do a little get together with some of the people.
All right.
So we'll see.
Let me know when he's back.
Yeah, I think he'll give us a program here in the next day or so.
All right.
Yeah. My face looks
We'll sign it. That's like what I was doing in America. I don't even say what I was doing. There were a few people around my age, but like by and large, people were like 2 decades older. I think they spaced everybody out, so
So they have this
May I take a look at that? I'd like to see if the print is readable for me or not.
No, Brennan drove through there. He was doing this thing where you drive from England to Romania. And you can do it in a car, and it's less than €1,000. It was just, yeah. And the car broke down. That's the whole point. The car breaks down. You need everybody else to come in by using the car.
But I think it'd be interesting.
Hi, everybody. We're almost ready, so I'm just going to say hi and get comfortable. Don't take your shoes off necessarily. Get comfortable. We're 2 minutes out of this new era of the virtual reality, when the virtual becomes reality, it's a different reality for me too. So, again, just want to say hi and welcome. Good to see you. Good to be seen. Good to be seen actually in clothes and high heels. Typically, if you see me at home, that's not the case. So again, thank you for venturing out and good to have you. So I will rely on my team to point to say kind of the countdown of 3, 2, 1 when we are, ready to go. Everybody doing okay? That's good. That's good. Thank you again for being us.
We are happy to be here.
Me too. You and me both. You and me and the 60 other friends. So I know we have some first timers there. Who's here for the first time? Oh wow! Look at that. Thank you. Welcome. Good to have you. So, my colleagues, if you see any, can you hold it on the door one more time? Can I ask my colleagues to make sure that we reach out to you, say hi, and I'm here from the beginning to the end, so please don't leave, come by and say hi, and I want to make sure. And then we have some long-standing members as well that can speak their truth, and there's my version of the truth. So, it's 7 o'clock on the dot, are we almost 5? So I'm going to go ahead and proceed, if I have a green light. So, again, hello and welcome to today's discussion with Michael Hamlin, Brookings Institution on U.S. Grand Strategy, the Art of War, and the Age of Peace. I'm Sandy Bayou, Chief Development Officer here at the Council, and I've been here for 10 years. So thank you all for your time to work. It's been kind of my celebratory month, but I've become to learn that you gotta say it out there, otherwise people don't know. So again, thank you for your warm congratulations. I love what I do, and therefore I am now. Hope all of you doing well, staying healthy, and again, appreciate your time and making your way up to see us today. Let me pass on some greetings to Greece. You might be thinking, who do I know in Greece? Interesting fact is that we have some members currently from the World Affairs on travel in Greece. They are enjoying Athens literally as we speak. They are in a beautiful hotel looking at the Acropolis as we speak. So they want to make sure that they say hi, that they're having a blast of time and enjoying really a bit of it. So greetings from Greece. And how many of you have traveled with us? Raise your hands. Wow, that's quite good. And how many of you are ready to travel internationally? I'll be passing out the sign-up sheet on your exit. But seriously, when we do travel, as I want to say, we do it professionally, we do it safely, we do it with the most respect to every culture. And as I say, we have a tour right now in Greece. The next one out of the gate is our trip to kingdoms of Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. There's great interest of those. We have some members here, so thank you so much for signing up just yesterday or today. So if you want to be part of that experience, please come see me afterwards. Again, we'd love to have you join us. So that is our January departure for kingdoms of Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. Love to do, love to see, love to learn there. A couple other programming notes. Does anybody know there's guy named James Bond. Bond, isn't it Bond? Next Tuesday, even better than Bond, we are hosting Jim Olsen, Tuesday the 5th. His title is the former CIA Chief of Counterintelligence. So he probably would have taught James Bond how to be James Bond. So if you want to come see him on Tuesday in the Woodlands. That is Jim Olsen joining us on Tuesday. Then, any of you have heard of this #1 New York Times bestsellers,
Yes, we did.
And there is actually book #1 as of today. The title of the book is The Peril, and it happens to be that Woodward and Rob Costa wrote it, and happens to be that Rob Costa will be with us next week. So
Next Wednesday.
next Wednesday at United Way in person. So
Wonderful.
absolutely. So we go from James Bond, the New York Times bestseller list, and I'm just saying we're doing well. And then back here at Amity, next Thursday, the 7th, we have Tara joining us, and that's going to be her talk on Iran. So heartbeat of Iran next Thursday back here. Furthermore, and any and all details about the trips, applications, membership, printout, come and see me, all on our website, wachouston.org. And now, I'm going to ask my colleague, Jahan, who runs our Global Young Professionals Programming, to come and join me, give some just as exciting details about Global Young Professionals Programming, and welcome our speaker today, give his bio. So Jahan, if you would join me, good to have you. Come on up. I'll go this way. Go this way. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jahan Japapour. I am part of the Global Young Professionals at the World Affairs Council. The Global Young Professionals, we engage with early career professionals in peer-driven learning and dialogue on leading international affairs topics. Our informal yet informative networking opportunities emphasize discussion, dialogue, and lively interaction between early career professionals, students, and anyone interested in learning. Join us to meet fellow professionals who are passionate about world affairs, global development, international business opportunities, and community engagement. With networking mixers, volunteering, tours, cooking lessons, and cultural dinners ahead, we look forward to connecting with you and hope you join us as we expand our global footprint. Now, on to our speaker for tonight. Michael O'Hanlon is a Senior Fellow and Director of Research in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution, where he specializes in U.S. defense strategy, military force, and American national security policy. He co-directs the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology, the Defense Industrial Base Working Group, and the Africa Security Initiative within the Foreign Policy Program. He is an adjunct professor at Columbia and Georgetown Universities, a professional lecturer at George Washington University, and a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. O'Hanlon has written several hundred op-eds in newspapers, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Times, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today, among others. His articles have appeared in Foreign Affairs, The National Interest, and International Security, among other publications. He has appeared on television and spoken on the radio some 4,000 times since September 11, 2001. And in 2021, O'Hanlon was named one of Washingtonians' most influential people in national security and defense. Joining him on the stage tonight will be the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston's Director of Programs, Ronan O'Malley. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome this evening.
Thank you very much, Jahan and Sonia. Thank you all very much for being here in person, and to our virtual audience at home. Wonderful to have you all join us as well. And especially like to thank all the students who are attending. I know a lot of you at home watching virtually. Hopefully we'll get you all back in person, maybe in January or something like that. And the students who did make it tonight, thanks. It's excellent to have you. I love for us to reach an audience of all ages, but I feel perhaps what's most impactful and to me most meaningful is really to reach a lot of our high school and college age students. And Michael, I just want to say thank you very much for coming. Michael is a long-time great friend of the council. We're fortunate. He's one of the premier defense analysts in the country for many, many years. Just to let all of you know, some of you I know already bought it, but we're selling Michael's excellent book, which we'll be discussing tonight, and a few other things, The Art of War and Age of Peace. We'll be selling it, and Michael's been signed up to sign the books afterwards as well, so please join us if you want to do that. But maybe just to get to where this book is, you've written an enormous amount of articles and books and papers. You briefed the Pentagon for years. What is it, in the 20 years since 9/11, sadly, we've lost almost 7,000 American men and women fighting for the United States. We've lost tens of thousands more have been injured, many of them gravely, and well over $3 trillion if you combine all forms of expenses and costs related, particularly to Afghanistan and Iraq. What is it that made you feel this book was necessary now? And maybe you talk about it a bit in the book yourself, but how is it that your own perspective changed? What is it that you perhaps came to realize that maybe you and maybe American administrations, whether Republican or Democratic, 5, 10, 20 years ago didn't think of? What was the real impetus why you felt this book was so necessary and really the drive behind you writing it?
First of all, Ronan, thank you, and it's great to be here. Greetings, everyone. I appreciate very much the Houston hospitality. What a wonderful city, what a great part of the country, and it's always a privilege to be at the World Affairs Council of Houston. And to speak to your question, even though we were trying to make peace with our own thinking about what we had done in the Middle East for the last 20 years, and that's obviously become even more of an acute question in the last few weeks and months. I also took stock of the fact that we were focusing more on Russia and China the last decade. And that's a good thing in most ways. But I think the old adage that if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing sometimes applies to American national security. And you asked me to sort of be a little reflective or contemplative. I remember, and I think many of you do as well, the Iraq War debate, right? Now, I still have mixed views about the fact that we overthrew Saddam. I don't think it was a completely crazy venture, although at the moment I would not say that it was, on balance, wise. And the President Bush from Houston probably has a little better legacy in regard to Iraq than the President Bush from Dallas at the moment, although I don't want to get into an intra-Texas rivalry. But I'm still hopeful that someday we can look back on the Iraq War and say that the cost, however enormous, still helped usher in a more hopeful future for the people of Iraq and for the region. But I don't think we're quite there yet. And so I lean towards the group that says the war was a mistake. But regardless of which side you're on, the amazing thing is that when we debated this war, before we undertook it in 2002 and 2003, the overwhelming majority of the country supported it. Now, I'm not blaming individual citizens. They had jobs, they had lives, they were listening to political leadership, and the political leadership wasn't always completely fair or honest. But I did note that when you take a step back from that debate, we got ourselves pretty worked up. Now, after 9/11, there was good reason to be worked up. We were nervous about what might happen next. And even though there was never any evidence that was convincing that tied Saddam to the 9/11 attacks, we had enough reasons to think this was a bad guy who had multiple nuclear weapons programs, and who knows what he could contemplate next. But the main point, to answer your question, is that we really got ourselves worked up. And a war that is often seen today as a mistake was enthusiastically endorsed by most of the country in 2003, which makes me think we could do it again. We could get ourselves too worked up. And the wonderful thing about America is that we have a sense of a mission, of a role in the world, of a commitment to common values, universal values, that we are the main champion to promote. We are the most powerful country that promotes those. They're in our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence. And we sometimes, that's very good, because it means that we do try to change the world for the better. But it also means that we're capable of wrapping ourselves a little bit in a mantra of, a holy mission, where we've anointed ourselves to be the chief perpetrator of this change. And half the time we do it badly. And, I've got a colleague named Bob Kagan. Many of you probably know Bob's writing. He's a brilliant guy and a very good historian. Some people think he's a neocon. I think of neocons as people who tend to pound their chest and say we're an exceptional nation and we're always, better than anybody else. And that's not really Bob. Bob basically says half the stuff we do, we get wrong. But thank God we try, because there's no other country that's capable of playing the role that we play. We have this geographic position where we're sort of protected by the oceans in Canada and Mexico from, serious threats. We can affect the security balances in Eurasia, but we're not really of Eurasia. And this gives us, and also that, plus our melting pot demography, our constitution, our history, it gives us a unique role. But it doesn't mean we usually make good decisions. I think we make a lot of bad decisions. I don't think with that, I'm not talking about you and your lives and your businesses and what other things, I'm guessing most of the people in this room make very good decisions most of the time. I don't think we make that many good decisions in Washington. But I still think that we have to stay engaged, and if it weren't for the United States playing this role of engagement, trying to make good decisions, even if we get them wrong half the time, that the world would be a much worse place. So, what this makes me think is, yes, we should focus on Russia and China. Yes, we need to think about where we are at this, turning point in history, but I'm really nervous we could get it wrong. And I'm really nervous we could overreact. I'm nervous that Putin and Xi could be aggressive. Don't get me wrong, I'm not blaming us for the fundamental problem. But I think we might overreact. If the worst thing the Chinese do is build up some artificial islands in the South China Sea, or fight a few Indian troops at the highest points of the Himalayas, by the standards of history, that's not that bad. So we need to find ways to push back, but we don't need to overreact, at least not now. Vladimir Putin caused a lot of trouble in Eastern Europe. But he also caused trouble in Eastern Europe after we had expanded NATO to about a dozen countries that were either former Warsaw Pact or Soviet republics. And if you're Putin and you're vindictive and you're bitter and you're petty, and you see the United States doing that, you're not going to see that as some innocent promotion of democracy. You're going to see that as getting in your backyard with an assertive policy that, for him, looks aggressive, even if we think of it as protecting people's rights to self-rule and democracy. I'm not suggesting Putin's interpretation is correct, but I am suggesting if we start really trying to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, we're going too far. And I think we might try. After all, the President Bush from Dallas, wherever you want to say he's from, but the one who lives in Dallas now, that President Bush promised in 2008 at the NATO summit that we would someday bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. I think that's a really bad idea for a smart guy like President Bush. I think his father was probably a better role model, because his father and Secretary Baker, who I had the privilege of meeting this summer for the first time in my life, which was an amazing experience. And again, God bless Houston for having Americans like that in your ranks. But I think Bush and Baker and Scowcroft and others were very careful when they worked with Gorbachev to make him feel like he could take his troops out of Eastern Germany and we would not profit from that at his expense. They spent a lot of time with Gorbachev to get that right. And now we're talking about bringing Ukraine into NATO. So, again, I think that we could overdo it. And I do favor stronger deterrence vis-a-vis Russia and China. For example, putting more U.S. forces in Poland has been a good idea. Putting more NATO forces in the Baltic states has been a good idea, because we've done it with a degree of restraint. But expanding the alliance further would make me nervous. Fighting the Chinese over unoccupied, uninhabited islands in the East and South China Sea would make me nervous. And yet there are some ideas in the American national security mentality that might do that. So I'm not just interested in restraining the United States. I think we have to stay very engaged. And I guess one last point, sorry to go on, sort of framing the overall argument. There are people in the academic community today in the United States who call themselves restrainers. But what they really want to do, a lot of them, is to pull back and actually eliminate a lot of the alliances that we built up over the last 75 years. I think that's a really bad idea as well, on the other side. Because the structure of the international order today with these alliances, especially NATO, US-Japan, US-Korea, US-Australia, this gives a certain sort of dependability to the way international politics play out. And it prevents the kind of rivalrous dynamics that led to the world wars. So I felt like, on the one hand, the Washington community might go too far and overdo the focus on confronting Russia and China. On the other hand, the academic community and certain politicians, like possibly Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, just to take two, and to try not to be partisan, take one of each party, might favor us doing a lot less on the grounds that we shouldn't be worried about the world while we have so many problems at home. But I think we have to do both simultaneously. So in a way, it's a passionate defense of the middle ground, but with some critiques of some prevalent ideas on both sides.
All right, and we'll get into kind of some specific, threats, whether they be nation states like Russia or China, or kind of the new threats evolving, or say cyber threats or digital threats. But can you discuss? You mentioned Restraint, your book. You base your strategy around the idea of resolute restraint. As you know, this is not offshore balancing. This is not relying upon allies in different regions to take the lead. It is not isolationism. But can you just very quickly give the audience kind of your core tenets of what resolute restraint means and what you advise U.S. policymakers should pursue?
So we need to defend our core allies and their core territories and populations as if they were American territory. We need to honor the mutual defense promises of the NATO alliance and the U.S.-Japan, U.S.-Korea, U.S.-Australia alliances. That's the resolute part. And also the sea lanes on which the global economy depends. So when the Chinese build up some military installations on rocks in the South China Sea, I don't like it, but I can live with it. When they try to interfere with the use of shipping lanes, I get much more upset. So that's where the resoluteness comes in. I think defending those core allies and those core interests. The restraint has to do with all the things I just alluded to. Future alliance expansion, which I think we have to be very skeptical about. Use of military force in crises, where I think we need to get out of our head that we are so dominant that we can just, sort of puff out our wings and get somebody else to back down in a crisis. We have to be a little bit smarter about how we handle crises, maybe a little bit more jujitsu, a little more indirect approach. And maybe, again, to avoid giving a long answer to this one, I'll just come back to one more specific idea, which is from George Kennan, the great American statesman of the World War II and early Cold War period. And George Kennan was skeptical about alliances. He later admitted that NATO worked out better than he thought. But he did say, he gave us the logic for coming up with NATO and the US-Japan alliance, because he said some parts of the world matter more than others. And from an American national security point of view, I'm not talking about human rights or humanitarian concerns, where I think every person is equal in God's eyes and in all of our eyes, and they should be. But in terms of our national security and our defense commitments, at that time, for Kennan, it was the British Isles, the West European industrial heartland of Germany and into France and the Low Countries, Russia, Japan, and the United States. Those were the 5 places. And we needed to make sure most of those 5 were not aligned against us. And that was a good, simple logic of how to think about core interests. Now, in today's world, the geography or the geoeconomics of power has shifted. And now East Asia is more important. China is more important. The Middle East is still important for energy, although luckily Texans are making sure that's not quite as the single point of failure for the global oil economy as it might have once been. But I think we do have to view the Middle East, especially around the Persian Gulf, and then East Asia, coming from Korea down through China into Southeast Asia. Those are additional zones that Kennan might have to prioritize. But I don't think we have to prioritize everything. And so I want to be resolute defending existing alliances and existing access to the global commons. But I want to be restrained in expanding our vision, and especially confusing alliances, military alliances, where we swear to potentially send sons and daughters of the United States to go fight and die for somebody else as if it were American territory. We've got to be very careful about confusing that with the other tools of democracy promotion. And so I don't really think that military alliances are a good way to promote democracy as a rule. And so that's where I would have some restraint.
And, you mentioned in the book, World War II is something, most Americans, really much of the world would hold out as, it's idealistic war. It was very hard. It was very difficult. It was clear black and white, clear victory. But going, the last number of decades going forward, We do not necessarily need to rely upon or to pursue an all-out victory. Sometimes containment or diminishment of an adversary is better. But maybe also you mentioned what's maybe more important is when not to fight. Not to kind of take somebody else's corollary, but you think of Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly and carry a big stick. I mean, are you advocating kind of maybe speak smartly and still carry a very big stick? I mean, what would you say in terms of us maybe taking smarter looks upon our defensive necessities around the world?
So I think that if our major allies are attacked, we have to go fight with them. So I don't want to be too confusing or have so many caveats and nuances to my presentation that I obscure the core points. If North Korea attacks South Korea, we should go fight. If the Chinese try to take Okinawa or a larger populated island in Japan, we should go fight with the Japanese against that. To me, the more complicated cases are also the more likely cases. For example, I did a book on this 2 years ago, the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. So this is where I maybe would not want to initially fight. The Senkaku Islands are claimed by both Japan and China. No one lives there. They are administered by Japan, although I'm not really sure what it means to say that they're administered by Japan when no one lives there and nothing happens there and no one visits. There is fishing in the waterways, but both sides do the fishing. And we as the U.S. government have this extremely convoluted approach to the Senkaku Islands where we say that we respect that Japan administers them, and therefore the U.S.-Japan treaty, in our opinion, applies. That we would be on the hook to help Japan defend its claims to them if those claims were challenged. But we do not have a government view as to whose islands they rightfully should be. So it's like, wow, that's a complicated, that kind of one I don't want to fight for. So if we wake up tomorrow and there are 100 Chinese ashore one of these Senkaku Islands, the last time an American military official spoke to what we should do, he basically said we should bomb that position or invade the island and take it back with the use of lethal force. I think that was the right thing for him to say publicly as an American general at the time. This was a 3-star named John Whistler, a good friend of mine, who was the head of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force when he made that statement in 2014. I think he was correct to say that because you don't want to encourage the Chinese to think they can get away with grabbing one. But if they actually did it, do we really want to draw first blood against a nuclear-armed superpower over uninhabited islands, the ownership of which we have no official government stance on who should have them? It just doesn't compute. You got to fight. You got to risk. If you're going to risk war and nuclear war, it should be over real things, important things. Now, some people will say, yeah, but if you concede that, then of course, now the Chinese get greedy. They think they can get away with murder. It's like Hitler after Czechoslovakia, and next thing you know, they're attacking Poland. Well, first of all, I don't really think the Chinese are like Hitler. But even if they were, I think what we need is a way to be resolute and punitive over that Senkaku Island scenario, but not go to war over it, not draw first blood against the Chinese. If they figure out some little way to finagle themselves ashore an island that's not even big enough for a decent golf course, I don't think that we start shooting. So those are just some examples. But again, core territory, population centers, major economic assets of our allies, yes, we should fight. These gray areas, these contested zones, these uninhabited spaces, I think we need, I'm not going to say a whole lot of nice things about President Trump tonight. You probably didn't expect me to. But I am going to give him credit for one thing, which is that he did start to show the Chinese that we can punish them in other ways besides military, if we put our mind to it. Now, most of Trump's war with the Chinese was about economic policy and economic fairness. But this whole notion of whether we should decouple from China, I think is an idea that's going to be around for the rest of our lives, and it's going to be always a shade of gray question. And to the extent the Chinese do something like take a Senkaku Island, you decouple a little more. And maybe it hurts us too, but it's still preferable to out-and-out military conflict. So I'm not suggesting you let them get away with these things. But I am saying that there are certain things really not worth fighting for when the other side has nuclear weapons. It's different to fight Russia or China than to fight Muammar Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein. Even those other latter guys wind up being tougher to defeat definitively than we sometimes expect. But China and Russia, if we go to war, it's gotta be over a really good reason.
And just to turn to some of those potential hotspots, obviously Russia, a serious concern after taking territory in Georgia. Obviously you could argue the Georgians kind of started that themselves. An example, maybe not defending it, they're not an ally, but someone who's kind of brought something on themselves. The issues with regards to Crimea, Eastern Ukraine. Your book, you talk about a lot of ways deterrence and being prepared before a fight or potential conflict is perhaps as important or more important than what you do once it occurs. Putin is famous for, you mentioned jiu-jitsu earlier, taking advantage of any opening he gets, being unpredictable. But in the book you state that you think if we continue, large enough military forces in Eastern Europe, that Putin, even if he thought he could win an opening battle or two, that he would not make the decision to start a war with the West. Why do you think that, considering his years of unpredictability? And is that just an example of why we really need to maintain our alliances and maintain our defensive posture?
Well, it's interesting. I don't claim to have Putin completely figured out, but I don't think he's unpredictable. In fact, Putin's been telling us since 2006 or 7 his worldview. And his actions sort of follow his worldview. By that point, he had decided the United States was an out-of-control superpower, and not even very good at being a superpower. And if you'll recall, by that juncture, what had happened is that we had invaded Iraq, we had invaded Afghanistan. At that point, Afghanistan was looking sort of okay, Iraq was not. Putin was even more upset, I believe, about the fact that we had sponsored democratic movements in Ukraine and Georgia, and even in Russia, where our NGOs and other organizations would promote fair play. And Putin doesn't like fair play in the former Soviet space. He wants his fellow strongmen to win. So he got more and more upset. And then, there would be nuclear weapons issues, missile defense debates, a few other things that would weigh in as well. The Kosovo War still had the Russians angry from 1999 because we beat up on their fellow Serb buddies. And so there were a lot of things that went into Putin's worldview, and he started to give speeches that laid out his anger. And then he started to act on it. Basically, you could date it in different ways, but I would say 2008 with Georgia was sort of a turning point. And then he stepped down from the presidency for 4 years to comply with the Constitution as it was then written in Russia, because he hadn't yet had a chance to monkey with it the way he has subsequently. So he had to temporarily give up the position to Medvedev, which made us all hopeful we could deal with a kinder, gentler Russian leadership. But meanwhile, Putin's still simmering and just waiting for his chance to get back into power. And then, of course, we seemed to take the other side in the 2012 Russian presidential elections. And as a former KGB guy, he's convinced whatever we're doing visibly above the surface is the tip of the iceberg compared to what we're trying to do below. That's Putin's worldview, and that's the evolution of his thinking. To me, it's actually pretty easy to understand. I don't like it. And I've read my colleague Fiona Hill, who before she worked in the Trump White House and got involved in impeachment testimony. By the way, her book is coming out next week, and it's a fantastic read. So I really recommend it. But she wrote about Putin. Angela Stent wrote about Putin. A bunch of other scholars that I respect have helped me feel like I sort of get Putin. And it doesn't mean that I can predict his next move, but I sort of feel where it's coming from, whatever it might be. So the good news with Putin, as I see it, and I'm going to have a chance to ask the Secretary General of NATO on Tuesday, because we're doing an event with him at Georgetown and Brookings. And he's been, Jens Stoltenberg, he's been the Secretary General since 2014, so he's seen a lot of this. But since about 2014, as you'll recall, that was the year when Putin grabbed Crimea after the Olympics, and then started, they shot down the Malaysian airliner, and they started stoking violence in eastern Ukraine. And since that time, even though it's been slow, NATO has responded. And we have put military forces into the former Warsaw Pact and Soviet republics in a way we've never had before. And I think it was a good move. I think there's enough force there that it's not enough to invade Russia, so Putin can't really complain, although he does. But it's enough to make it pretty clear we're committed. There would be a lot of French and German and British and Canadian and American casualties in any opening of a Russian attack on those countries. I think Putin's smart enough to figure out that if he attacks those countries, he's now got general war against the United States and NATO. And therefore, I'm pretty sure he won't do it. You mentioned cyber already. He may try more devious things like that. But I don't see him trying to grab territory there. Ukraine is still up for grabs, and he sees it as his backyard, his immediate backyard. And, of course, we've put sanctions on Russia in response to Ukraine. We've given the Ukrainian military weapons. It hasn't been enough to protect Ukraine or to liberate those territories. I think there's a chance it has been enough to get Putin's attention and to make him think maybe seizing more of Ukraine is not such a good idea. Because if these sanctions have been in place now for 7 years, through all sorts of vicissitudes of American and European politics, and we still have kept the sanctions. And by the way, Russia's economic growth has been about 1% a year through that period. I'm not sure he really wants to go to the mat with us on another round of sanctions, even if we wouldn't fight to defend Ukraine. And the last point I would make, and there are probably people in this crowd who know Russia at least as well or better than I do and may want to get into this conversation soon, but I think that Putin has started to realize his long-term legacy is in some jeopardy. Because when he came to power, he was loved in Russia because he got them back on their feet after Gorbachev and Yeltsin. We love Gorbachev and Yeltsin, but the Russians don't. Because for them, these were the guys that not only conceded defeat in the Cold War, not only allowed the Soviet Union to break apart, but then allowed the sort of shock therapy, the robber barons to come in, the economic chaos of the 1990s, the decline in Russian living standards. By the way, I think the Americans did a bad job with that too. Shock therapy, I think, was very badly designed. Because we basically said, whoever's got the cash, go ahead and buy those state assets. Because we're convinced the private sector just turns things around. No. We have no reason as Americans to think that when you come out of a state-controlled economy and you let the richest people who can get access to cash buy up assets, that's going to be good for economic growth. That's not how our capitalism ever worked. And what we did was create this sense of unfairness as Russians started to resent each other, resent the robber barons, resent the West and their own place in life. And Putin came into power, and he may not have been the most brilliant economist or government leader, but the Russian economy started to stabilize and then grow. He benefited from higher oil prices for a while. At that point, his legacy was not only about Russian power, but it was about Russian standard of living. Now that's at risk, because for the last 9 years that he's been president, the Russian economy has been flat. Does he really want another round of punitive sanctions from the West? So I think, I'm not saying we can let down our guard on the military front, but my sense is that we've done enough to deter a Russian attack on the Baltics and Poland if we stay vigilant and stay present in those countries. And now the question is going to be trying to stabilize the area to the east. And that's going to require some creative thinking, where we need Jim Baker maybe to step back into the ring. There aren't too many people of the current generation who have thought hard about how to, what you need to do is stay resolute and tough with Russia, but still sort of appreciate how the world looks to them historically. And Baker and Bush could do that, and Sam Nunn could do that, and Bill Perry could do that, George Kennan could do that. These people are all gone from the scene more or less now. And so I think we've got to find that way. I'm not suggesting we can just sit on our laurels and assume that Europe will stay stable going forward, because it's not even completely stable right now. But I do think we have some of the key pieces of deterrence that have been pretty well established, and Putin knows it. There's still an unsettled quality of what's going on in Ukraine and Georgia, and I'm in favor of thinking big about a new security architecture for Europe that could try to stabilize that without bringing them into NATO. But overall, I feel like Putin's not that hard of a guy to figure out. And the good news is we've addressed some of the immediate glaring vulnerabilities in our defense posture that make it less likely he will attack. The bad news is he's still playing games. He's still muddling around in Ukraine and Georgia. It's not yet stable. So we need now the next round of big thinking about new ideas for that.
And looking at in many ways, a much more challenging adversary, the Soviet Union, always a very large and capable military force, nuclear power, but economically a minnow. China, obviously a massive economy. It has impacts all around the world. Despite the brutality of Mao being willing to kill or have millions of young people die for different policies, relatively speaking, militarily speaking, outside of Korea, Vietnam, don't want to say they're minor occurrences, there was not major military interventions by the Chinese over the years. How concerned are you about China actually now maybe having more bravado and more confidence doing something militarily? And then also, how do we keep up and compete with China when it's a much more level or leveling playing field, especially in terms of economics and influence all around the world?
Yeah, by the way, it's a big question, obviously, maybe the challenge of our day. But just as a sort of easier entree into trying to answer it, I was recently talking to a retired American four-star, I won't say who, but he was reflecting on how when he meets with the Chinese leader, when he used to meet with Chinese military leadership in his active duty days, they would talk about previous experience, right? And this American four-star, like most of our generation, had been deployed in combat several times, led troops in combat. And he said, he would always say to his Chinese counterparts, and of course you've had your experiences too, but in his head he's thinking, no, you haven't. And that cuts both ways. Because on the one hand, we should appreciate the Chinese haven't used a lot of military force. That should be at least somewhat to their credit. And by the standards of history, a rising power with the capacity of China, not yet to have engaged in a war of conquest or of acquisition, is quite restrained. On the other hand, some of those Chinese generals probably resented being, not reminded, because this four-star wasn't throwing it in their face, but that they don't really have any combat experience. And they have to wonder how they would do in war. I mean, like me, I'm a civilian. I wonder how I would do as a soldier. I wouldn't be that good. And I certainly am not going to go out and pick a fight with somebody on the presumption that I would be, never having been tested or never having demonstrated that. So the Chinese have a tradition of relative restraint. Plus they have what has to be a partial military inferiority complex vis-a-vis us, and yet they have a lot of swagger because nobody's been growing faster, so how do you predict? I think they're much harder to predict than Putin. How do you predict the way these different competing forces affect their psychology? And especially now that, the scariest thing is Taiwan, because of course they care more about Taiwan at some level than we do. And it's just a fact, because they see it as part of their country. And we see it as a really important friend that we broke off formal diplomatic relations with 40 years ago and broke up our alliance with. And we go around the world complaining to small countries when they establish relations with China instead of Taiwan, but we did the exact same thing 40 years ago as a deliberate choice. And so we are fundamentally in a more ambiguous place. And I think there's a chance the Chinese would fight over Taiwan. So that probably is the biggest core problem. So, I think overall the Chinese are pragmatists. They certainly want more power and prestige and influence on the global stage, but they're getting it without fighting. And to the extent they have people that we may find a little bit aggressive and dictatorial, but who also seem smart and sober, like Xi Jinping. I mean, I think the guy's smart, and I think he doesn't make decisions without thinking them through pretty well. To the extent they have leaders like that, I think it's pretty unlikely that they're going to decide to go to war in pursuit of these ambitions that they can probably partially attain without war anyway. So I sort of don't mind the competition that we're in with China that much, because to me, it's a competition where we have most of the allies. 2/3 of the world is made up of market-oriented democracies. Most of them are our formal military allies. And whenever China does something bad, even more people want to hang out with us, like India. On the other hand, if China wants to compete by building infrastructure, Belt and Road Initiative or what have you. And yeah, they often propose mercantilistic terms that would advance their own interests more than the countries that receive the loans or the construction. But we have the ability to remind the rest of the world, you've got a choice. You don't have to go to China for capital, as long as we find good alternatives that we can provide. I think we can do pretty well in this competition. I don't really think either side wants to resolve it by war. I think both have thought hard enough about what that would probably mean. Now, I'll finish by saying, having given that slightly encouraging prognostication, I want to admit that I could be wrong. I want to admit that we could wind up with a president who makes decisions impulsively. They could wind up with a leader who does. Or the Taiwan issue itself could become so inflammatory and acute that they decide they have no choice but to try to resolve the matter militarily, because waiting would be even worse. And I don't think any of those scenarios are likely, although we could have another impulsive leader in the United States, I suppose. But I think that we have to worry about them. So constantly nurturing these alliances, constantly being present in the Pacific theater. But I got to say, and maybe anticipating one of your later questions, I'll just put it out as a tease right now. I'm pretty happy with General Milley's phone call, because I'd rather see us err on the side of restraint, especially when there was no good reason to fight anyway. It's not like China was, sending missiles over Taiwan the week before, and then Milley calls up and says, "Don't worry, we're not going to attack you." That might have been a mistake under those circumstances. But if the only issue is whether American domestic politics are going to produce some kind of a crisis that leads us to lash out overseas, I have no problem with Milley using a hotline to try to dampen that down, because I think, in general, if we ever go to war against Russia or China, it better be for a damn good reason. It better not be over a Senkaku Island or over an American domestic quarrel or something like that. So, that's how I see the China challenge. It's going to be with us for the rest of our lives and probably our kids' lives. But I think we have a lot of good tools to engage in that competition. And for the most part, we should be trying to keep our powder dry. Military force is a part of it, but more by way of positioning, deployment, exercises, shows of solidarity with allies. If we ever get to the point where we're shooting at the Chinese or they're shooting at us, then we're already 3/4 of the way towards having lost the game.
And just relating to that, a lot of you probably know about it, but you're referring to General Milley, the current chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's joint chairman for the last 2 years of Trump's administration and currently under Biden, the senior most military officer in the United States, the primary advisor to the President, National Security Council, the Secretary of Defense. Could you maybe comment upon, just related to that, the fact that a general of his stature felt the need to reach out to his counterparts in the People's Liberation Army, and maybe also just in a broader term, what does that mean that we think about it since World War II? Congress has not declared war. American presidents, both Democratic and Republican, have gotten more, controlling with regards to their abilities to, be a commander-in-chief. Do you think we maybe need another understanding or better definition of how and when an American president can, escalate, the military conflict?
Yeah, I do think we need a little bit more restraint. And by the way, again, I said I wasn't going to say too many nice things about President Trump, but let me at least try to concede one more thing that could be worse. For a guy who seems so belligerent in his interpersonal relationships, he doesn't seem to like violence in international relations, which is good. So I'm relieved that this guy, who might be president again someday, doesn't really seem to want to pick a fight. But I do feel that not just Donald Trump, many American presidents have now had too much power to launch a war, and I think people in this room know the history of a lot of this debate. But in a nutshell, the War Powers Act after Vietnam was passed by Congress over the veto of the president, but presidents of both parties ever since have never conceded its constitutionality. And by the way, the War Powers Act isn't even that restrictive on a president, because it says they don't need permission until 60 days into a conflict, by which point you're pretty far in potentially. Nuclear war could be over, right? And so we have a lot of debate in Washington about the 2001 legislation that President Bush requested after the 9/11 attacks, the authorization on the use of military force, and whether that should be updated. And I think maybe it should, but that to me is the least of the issue. The bigger issue is starting a new war without congressional approval. And the War Powers Act was an effort to say declarations of war are sort of passé for this fast-moving world of ours. We in the Congress are not even going to insist on our constitutional right to a declaration of war. That's implicitly what was in the War Powers Act, that acknowledgement. But I think that if a president's going to launch a new war, probably you need the kind of process that President George W. Bush and President H.W. Bush did undertake with the Congresses of their day before the respective Iraq wars, where they both got authorization. Not declaration of war, but authorization from Congress. And of course, they were both nervous that if they didn't get it, they might feel the need to go to war anyway. So neither one of them really enjoyed that debate because they both felt they needed to do what they were going to do. And they both might have done it even without congressional blessing. But I think that model is okay. But the nuclear weapons model is concerning to me. And so I'll just tell, in other words, there are different pieces to this question. As you well know, Ronan, there's the AUMF and the counterterrorism piece. There's the War Powers Act, Declaration of War Peace. Then there's the nuclear weapons issue. And right now, a president has no particular restraints on his or her ability to launch a nuclear weapon. And so my favorite story on this front, just to make it a little bit more approachable and a little bit less of a legalistic matter. General John Hyten, who, as many of you will know, is the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs right now. He's a 4-star Air Force general, and he was previously at Strategic Command as the combatant commander. Strategic Command up in Colorado is responsible for our nuclear weapons. So if there were going to be a nuclear attack, the chain of command is the president issues the order through the Secretary of Defense, which could or might not be transmitted by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who's not actually crucial in this whole chain of command, to the combatant commander. So president, SecDef, combatant commander. So John Hyten was potentially the recipient of an order from a president to launch a nuclear attack. So a reporter asked him in 2017, when President Trump and Kim Jong-un were having their War of the Words across the Pacific, a reporter asked General Hyten, what would you do, sir, if President Trump gave you an illegal order to launch a nuclear attack? Now I felt bad for General Hyten, right? Because that's a catch-22 if I ever saw one. Because if you say, yes, I would launch it anyway because he's my boss, well, now you're the greatest mass murderer since Adolf Hitler. But if you say, no, I wouldn't, because I don't want to be a mass murderer, now you're insubordinate, and you're violating your legal responsibility to your president. So obviously you don't want to answer the question that's posed if you're General Hyten. You have to find some way to deflect the question or reinterpret it and then give an answer to that. So the good news was General Hyten was aware, I believe, that he was going to be at a conference the following week where the same reporter would be present. And so I think they agreed we would pick up the conversation then, in public. And in the intervening few days, General Hyten and his team thought hard about what he should say. And they came up with what I think was a brilliant answer, but it's not completely reassuring as a long-term solution to this problem, because General Hyten said, well, if President, he didn't repeat the words. He said, what I would do is I would talk to the President, we would develop legal options for nuclear weapons employment without getting into the philosophical question of what that might be for a given problem. But presumably not mass murder, presumably not starting with annihilating cities right off the bat. But Hyten didn't get into that. He just said we would develop legal options. President Trump would choose, I'm not even sure he used the name Trump, he might have just been speaking more hypothetically. The president would choose which of those options he wanted, and then I would execute that option. Which I thought was a brilliant way to sort of deflect an unanswerable question and still keep his job. But
he's not a politician.
And he's not even a politician. But it does get to your point that we don't really have, if we're relying on, the former head of Strategic Command, the head of Strategic Command to come up with that kind of an improvised game plan. to prevent potential for one person to incinerate the planet, then you have to ask if we really have enough checks and balances. So I think we should think hard, about, there are different ways to think about this. Authorizing that the attack would be humane, legal, compliant with the laws of war. You could maybe ask a justice on the Supreme Court or the Attorney General to weigh in. Somebody you could reach on the phone fast, because you might not have a lot of time in this scenario, but especially for a preemptive nuclear attack. You might want to do that, and then also you might want to confirm that the president really was the one giving the order. This wasn't a cyber spoof or a deep fake from somebody who wasn't the president. And so you probably would want to have mechanisms to confirm those two things, and I think we need a lot more work on that.
Thank you all for the great questions. We always have a great selection of questions from the audience. I think this is the first time I've had so many questions that were all the same. I have about 7 or 8 questions all about Taiwan. So I'll just pick out 2 and please take it away from there. Linda asked, do you suggest the U.S. and our allies fight to protect Taiwan should China attack the country? And related to that, Andrew asked, could you walk us through the U.S. and Chinese stances on Taiwan? And walk us through any initial likely steps of a conflict there.
So on the latter question, the Chinese consider Taiwan part of their territory, and it's as if Hawaii has seceded, and they want it back, and they feel that it was an outgrowth of their civil war, that the losers in their civil war fled to Taiwan, and they weren't powerful enough at that time to then come take back the island. And the whole way in which World War II ended, and they'd been beaten down by the Japanese for so long, left them incapable of properly resolving their own civil war. So it's not even their fault that the country is divided, and they want to reunite it. That's their position. It's pretty straightforward. The only question is, how patient will they be in pursuing reunification? For many years, they didn't have the choice of military attack, because even though Taiwan's 100 miles from them and 8,000 miles from us, and even though they fought us to a pretty impressive standoff in the Korean War, they would not have had a chance against our naval and air forces in sort of the open domain of the Western Pacific. That's changing. That's already changed. And so that's part of why this is a scarier question than it might have been. Our position is the complicated one. Like I mentioned a minute ago, we are not allied with Taiwan. We do not even have an ambassador in Taiwan. We do not formally recognize them as a country, but we've been making it clear ever since the Taiwan Relations Act that Ronald Reagan signed in 1982 that we feel a special bond to them, and that if the Chinese were to attack them, especially without provocation, then we might very well get involved. Well, the Chinese are never going to attack Taiwan without any provocation. The question is how much, so our stated principles by that law and by our formal international, communique since then don't really resolve the issue of what we would do. So I think to get to the first of the 2 questions, what we need to do is, first of all, not just think that because we have a military budget 3 times the size of China's, that we would necessarily win a war over Taiwan just because we decide to fight it. We might lose it. And then the question might be, whoever wins the tactical fight, who's prepared to accept defeat versus to escalate to general attacks against the homeland, possibly to include nuclear strikes. If this is your own territory that you think is being attacked or that is at risk, as the Chinese do, we should not dismiss the possibility of nuclear threats or even nuclear weapons usage. So to me, there's no longer a clear trajectory to where that conflict goes if it begins. Both sides obviously have an enormous preference for not incinerating their countries as they try to resolve the Taiwan issue. But we've already seen in the world wars that basic obvious fact that nobody has an interest in seeing their country destroyed over trying to move the border in Northern Europe this way or that way, it doesn't prevent wars from happening. Rationality doesn't always prevail. So, I think we need multiple deterrent strategies without telling China exactly which one we would resort to in a given case, because we don't know ourselves. It would depend on our president. It would depend on the path to war. and just how much we did think that China was the primary perpetrator. And so I think we need to not rule out the possibility of some degree of military response, even though we might lose that war. But we need to develop various approaches of economic warfare backed up by indirect military action to give ourselves additional options. And so to me, this is where the decoupling debate gets pretty interesting, not so much at an economic level, but at a national security level, as an alternative to a US-China conflict. I would want to be able to interdict the sea lanes in the Indian Ocean that China relies on for oil coming from the Persian Gulf and Africa. Then China can retaliate by cutting off oil headed for Japan and Korea. Japan and Korea need imported oil even more than China does, as some people in this room I'm sure know better than I. And so the strategy only works if our allies are aboard and have prepared themselves in advance to be resilient to some of the steps that China could take against them. And so that's part of why I want to get cracking on this kind of preparation now for more economic resilience and figuring out ways to mitigate our vulnerabilities or our dependencies on China. So the idea of being content with China providing 95% of the world's rare earth metals, that's just a bad place to be. And we're being very sluggish about fixing that, even though we've identified it as a problem for several years. So basically, yes, maybe depending on what China does, we might want a direct military response, but we better be aware we could lose that. China has a lot of quiet submarines. They have a lot of precision strike missiles. Our bases in the Western Pacific, our ships could all be put at risk. A lot of them might be lost. It's not clear who wins that fight, and therefore it's a last resort. And I think the most likely way that China would attack Taiwan is not an invasion, but a blockade. Because the nice thing for China is they can put the Taiwanese economy at risk without putting most of the Taiwan people at risk, who they claim are their own kindred co-nationals. And so if they're fighting for the right to rule people and they're killing a couple million of them in the process, that's not the best way to establish your legitimacy as their rightful ruler. But if you tear down the economy for a while, and then you can always back off temporarily if the United States surges its 7th Fleet. So I think the much more plausible scenario is a blockade. Maybe combined with cyber attack and maybe some targeted assassinations, I don't know, but not an all-out invasion attempt. So we need a strategy that can break a blockade, but it's hard to break a blockade when they do it by submarine and missile. So that's why I want to be able to hurt them in the Indian Ocean. But most of all, I want to be able to start our response with economic warfare and then see if we can find a diplomatic path out. The military piece has to be there, but it should be indirect and it should be secondary to the economic threat, especially in the scenario of a blockade.
And we're just about out of time, but again, please join us and get one of Mike's excellent books afterwards. It goes through the traditional 4+1, Russia, China. We didn't get to all of them, really, North Korea, Iran, the threats of terrorism, but then also a much more important, or not more important, but equally important and something that can compound those existing threats, the 4+1, or the new threats to kind of the current world order. And just a great question, I know if you could just briefly touch upon it, it's your 4+1, the new 4+1, this is your +1. Someone asked a great question. Will China, Russia, and other adversaries exploit America's depolarization?
They certainly are trying already. And, I think the Chinese, in fact, I have a colleague, Rush Doshi, who wrote this brilliant book on Chinese grand strategy. And he said, he's now in the administration working for the Biden team, but he says in 2016, when the Chinese watched the Bernie Sanders-Donald Trump phenomenon, and he put it in nonpartisan terms and used those two names together. He said just the sheer visibility of America's internal cleavages is what convinced the Chinese to be more ambitious in their own schedule for trying to expand their influence. So I think, we've obviously seen Russia try to do this very deliberately, going back to 2016 at least. So there's absolutely no doubt. Which is why I will finish. You mentioned that there are a lot of the 4+1s, we didn't get time to discuss, and if I could just have 1 minute, the old 4+1, the Pentagon's 4+1 is Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and terrorism. And the terrorism piece is transnational and it's different, so it's a +1. And what I said also is to me, these new transnational threats, represent a second 4+1, a second axis. It doesn't displace the old threats. It may make some of them worse. So I'm not making the pitch that we need to just focus on the new threats because the old threats are somehow obsolete. We got to think about all 10. But to me, the new 4+1 is just a way to sort of categorize. One would be biological threats, including pandemics, but also biological weapons. A second would be nuclear proliferation, as distinct from the nuclear arsenals of the existing powers. A third would be cyber threats, to include hacking and cyber attacks and ransomware, but also AI. A fourth would be climate and its implications for human well-being and for national security around the world. And then the last one, the +1, is our own internal cohesion. So to me, that was a nice way to sort of just summarize and categorize these different categories. But the most important thing we can do is to try to turn down the volume a little bit on our differences and to try to see the other side. So again, I don't know how many people who go to World Affairs Council's meetings in Houston actually voted for President Trump, but I'm guessing some of you. So I will try to make one more point about President Trump's presidency, which I sort of appreciated. Unfortunately, he didn't really follow through. But I actually sort of liked, thinking of the old 4+1, I sort of liked his attempt to reach out to Kim Jong-un. And I'm probably in the distinct minority in the Washington foreign policy community with that opinion. I don't think in the end Trump did it well. He was undisciplined. He wasn't even well served by his own national security team. The John Boltons of the world fell back on the traditional hard-line view that any denuclear. And maybe we can look for places like that to forge some kind of new ideas in our foreign policy so we don't just fight over the traditional partisan divides.
Well, again, I want to thank everyone here in person and a lot more of you at home for joining us virtually. We look forward to hosting you all again soon, events next week. And again, Michael Hanlon, a longtime great friend of the council, thank you so much for coming down to us again. And really, this is, I think, an important book. It's a reflective book. It's an important book that looks at overall American strategy everywhere in the world. And I think it's, kind of very, I suppose, piercing and thoughtful and, no holds barred, but it's probably where we as a country need to be looking. And I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you very much to Michael Hanlon.
Thanks for all you.